My name is Greg Tung. I'm a principal with Friedman, Tung, and Sasaki Urban Design, formerly known as Friedman, Tung, and Bottomley. We were the designers and planners for the downtown specific plan, as well as for the design of First Street, streetscape in downtown. So we're here to talk about urban design issues related to the site. First, we're going to talk about open space issues. Second, we'll talk about pedestrian connectivity. And third, we'll speak a little bit about urban fabric and density. So relative to open space issues, let's talk about goals, functions, and sizes. So this slide shows a view of the existing open spaces and special linkages in the downtown core. What you can see here first is First Street, which is really kind of an open space in itself in that it's got the double rows of trees and people love to stroll along it, and it ties together the three plazas at the crossroads of downtown, the Livermore Plaza, Flagpole Plaza, and Lizzie Fountain Plaza, as well as the Bankhead Theater Plaza in front of the theater itself, as well as a series of walkway connections that go across Livermore Avenue, across Railroad Avenue to the parking structure, and tying into the Iron Horse Trail with a new bridge over Livermore Avenue. And finally, there's the Carnegie Park at the lower left of the slide. And for scale, we've shown the block size of the former Lucky site block, which is about 575 feet north to south and 730 feet east to west. This diagram comes from the downtown specific plan, in which we looked at the network of open spaces and future open spaces, of which these check marks show the ones that actually have been implemented after the downtown specific plan. So we've done the improvements to the intersection at First and Livermore, Lizzie Fountain Plaza, Flagpole Plaza, and now Livermorean Plaza, which is about to be improved. Small plazas and seating areas all along First Street. Again, the Bankhead Theater Plaza and the walking connection to the new parking structure across Railroad Avenue, as well as the Iron Horse Trail improvements. What hasn't happened yet is the public open space at the heart of the Lucky site that was discussed in the downtown specific plan, as well as other pedestrian connections east-west and then south to Carnegie Park. So in looking at the plazas at the crossroads of town at First Street and Livermore Avenue, we can see that Lizzie Plaza, Fountain Plaza, Flagpole Plaza, and Livermorean plazas are all roughly the same size. They're pretty close to a quarter acre, and you can see the dimensions are roughly 98 by 100, 95 by 122, and Flagpole is 100 by 210, but it's sort of triangular in shape. So they're very similar in size, and they're all very sort of human-scaled spaces. When we look at the Bankhead Theater Plaza, the functional open space in the center, in the ellipse, is actually pretty much the same size, 100 by 120, also just under a quarter acre. But because the other open spaces outside the ellipse and the paved areas going to the edges of the building and to the curb are more like 140 by 216, the overall space feels larger at almost a little over 2/3 of an acre. And then Carnegie Park at 225 by 320 is 1 2/3 acre, and it actually feels even larger because it has streets surrounding it on 4 sides. So that's a factor we'll talk about again in a moment. So that kind of gives you a sense of the different scales of open spaces that are existing in downtown. We're going to now look at several examples from around the Bay Area and California of other downtown open spaces to kind of get a sense of scale and character. This is Litton Plaza in downtown Palo Alto, which is on University Avenue, the main street. It's at the corner, which is sort of like the way Livermorean Plaza works. And it's got actually a business, a pizza restaurant opening out onto it. And it's used for kind of daily gathering and eating outdoors and whatnot. It's also about a quarter of an acre. So you can see that size is actually pretty typical in downtowns of this kind of pedestrian-friendly scale. You can see also that the distance between the buildings that enclose the site partially is roughly about a half acre, or about 141 by 170. So again, that factor of that added space created by streets plays into the feel of those kinds of spaces. So we've superimposed Lytton Plaza at the same scale in the middle of the Lucky's site, just so you can kind of get a sense of scale. And you can see, again, it's pretty similar to the scale of Livermorium and Flagpole and Lizzie Fountain plazas. This is an interesting example from Old Town Pasadena. It's called One Colorado Courtyard, and it is actually in the middle of a block that's been redeveloped. It's an open space that doesn't have streets around it. Instead, it's connected by a series of wonderful walkways and paseos that have public art and storefronts opening out onto them. It's heavily used in downtown Pasadena and Old Town Pasadena for showing outdoor movies, and then for just everyday gathering and outdoor dining. So it's, again, just a little bigger than a quarter acre, 92 by 135, and very well defined by the buildings around it, and actively fronted on by doorways and shops on all four sides. So again, we're showing this in context, what that scale is like on the site. Courthouse Square in downtown Redwood City is an interesting example in that it's a civic plaza, and it's got some small buildings that help to enclose the space. So in fact, the active part of the plaza for events is, again, about a quarter acre, and that's something that happens over and over again. You see that when you get a lot larger than a quarter acre for a completely wide open space, it starts to feel kind of empty. So having these other elements in this example of fountains and small pavilion buildings are a key to making that space successful. There, when you go all the way out to the building enclosure, again, you've got almost 1.5 acres, which makes the place feel really spacious, as you can see here. So putting that again on site, you can see it's a bit larger, but the active portion in the center, the actual open space for special events, is again about a quarter acre. Finally, we're looking at a green town square, Healdsburg Plaza in downtown Healdsburg. It's a green space that has a bit of paving on it, and surrounded by streets on all four sides, and also very importantly, all four sides have continuous storefronts with lots of doors and windows opening out onto it. So it's very well connected and well watched by everybody in that area. So you can see that the square itself is about 1.2 acres, 260 by 200, but the building to building dimensions is 380 by 336, which is almost 3 acres in size. And even though that's a fairly large size, they don't have problems pretty much with that much loitering or encampments or anything like that, because again, you've got storefronts and doors and windows and eyes on the street and eyes on the plaza from all sides, so nothing goes unnoticed there. So that's something to be thinking about when you size an open space and figure out the character, is how you're going to make sure it's going to be well watched and well peopled. So again, on site you can see now that the actual plaza size is about 1.2 acres in comparison to some of the other spaces. So some issues to consider with regard to the core open space. The specific plan and lots of public input since then have all pointed to how necessary a major public open space in the Lucky site, west of Livermore Avenue, which should be. It can be, but it doesn't need to be a formal civic plaza, because Bankhead Theater Plaza already performs this role. It needs to be central and large and sizable enough to anchor the center, be a place of arrival, and have its own identity. Based on the examples we saw, sizing from about a quarter to maybe just over an acre can work very well. If you put edge streets around it, it helps add to the spaciousness and the perceived size. And those streets, if they're configured as very slow streets, so they're not cut-throughs, can really be wonderful additions. And the character should really help to complement the the uses and the density around it with greenery. And that's why also it's important to have it at the center as opposed to the edges, where if it kind of bleeds out onto Livermore Avenue or especially more heavily trafficked streets, it doesn't really serve that same role. And it's not as much of an amenity to either the residences or hotels or any other uses that you'll have on the block. And then finally, it should have easy to find access, pedestrian access from all four sides. It needs to have multiple doorways on it to activate it and no large blank wall edges. And that issue is going to come up when we talk about parking structures potentially. Next, we're going to talk a bit about pedestrian network and connectivity issues. This map then shows all of the existing streets and walkways in town, some of the mid-block passages. And so you can see with the 575 by 730 foot size of the Lucky site block, ideally you want to cut that in half in terms of walking distances. And you can see that over on the block with the Bankhead Theater, it's been subdivided by walkways so that you never have to go more than 390 feet to get from a corner to a crosswalk. So all the developers' concepts to date have met this intent of subdividing the block that came out of the downtown specific plan and from the community input of that plan. And any schemes going forward are going to need to take that to implement that in their layouts. When we look at then some of the parking garage options that have been studied, this is kind of an interesting exercise, again, to think about the impacts of these on that connectivity and the activity in the middle of the block. So when we look at the Site 1 example of a 5-story parking structure with a kind of long, thin structure on the southwest corner of the site, you can see that that would potentially block one of the existing pedestrian pathways and driveways that's there now. We're not sure whether that would end up being a driveway or possibly a pedestrian cut through, but that would certainly impact it if you couldn't make that crossing. That would mean you'd have 500 feet of having to go around that building and not getting into the inside of that site from First Street. On the other hand, by having a thin structure, that gives you some room to do some liner use on the north side potentially. But finally, you have to consider with a 5-story building, that's going to throw a bit of a shadow towards the north. So if you've got an open space there, how that faces onto the open space is going to be an important issue to consider. When you look at Site 2, this would be a 4-story structure on the west side of the site facing on L Street. And even though it might block that east-west connection that's shown there, that orange bar, the distance that it would have to go around would be about 370 feet from First Street to the get-around. And that's pretty similar to the distance from Livermore Avenue to the crosswalk to the parking structure coming off from the Bankhead Theater. So that's pretty acceptable. Having the commercial option, as was described in that scheme, meaning having some ground floor retail potentially opening out onto L Street, would be a desirable thing because you don't want to have that long an exposure without windows and doors and activating uses on the ground floor. Site 3 would appear to allow all the through-site streets and or walks, but it might not have enough room to have liner uses added onto it. And again, since you've got 5 stories going further north, deeper into the site, if you've got some kind of central open space there, that again is a shadowing issue. And also, again, without liner uses to kind of wrap the building with, the parking structure with, the architecture of that structure has to be really treated well with human scale openings and not look so much like your typical parking garage. Finally, Site 4, if you have a structure that's below grade, it has no real urban design impacts, except that you do have a trench that's created by the entry and exit ramps. And as has been discussed before, this is the highest cost per parking space of any of the schemes because undergrounding costs a lot more. So that creates some trade-off issues relative to other possibilities of what you could do with that kind of funding. And finally, there's the customer acceptance issues and placement of the entrances to be friendly and secure. So overall, out of all of these, probably Site 2 is probably the most beneficial from an urban design perspective of looking at the connectivity and having better sort of balancing of impacts by having also some potential for ground floor retail and 4 stories as opposed to 5. So next, in terms of pedestrian connectivity, there's been, we understand, some discussion about potentially using pedestrian bridges to cross Livermore Avenue and or Railroad Avenue, connecting from the theater site. And so for hotel sites in particular, if you're trying to go from a hotel to a parking structure across the street, again, people were talking about possibly having pedestrian bridges. So one issue to think about there is that pedestrian bridges in downtowns, or as they're sometimes called, skywalks or skyways, were built in many cities across the United States in the 20th century. Minneapolis, St. Paul, Des Moines, Baltimore, and San Francisco. Though many of these enclosed skywalks are still popular in the cold weather places, a lot of them have been taken down, like in Baltimore, because they were, considered to kind of hurt the street life. They pulled people away from the street. And local examples in San Francisco include the Embarcadero Center and Golden Gateway Commons, which you can see in the upper right. And you can see how basically if people are not coming down to the street, they're just not going to the stores and so forth. Now, skywalks are very often used in very big megacities in Asia, like Shanghai, Taipei, and Bangkok, because those streets have been widened so much to add lots of traffic lanes, and they result in narrow sidewalks, and they have tons of people on the ground. But those conditions are not what we have here. So a potential alternative to a pedestrian bridge to cross the street is change the character of the street so that you move away from a kind of highway-like street to more downtown-like. When you look at the intersection of Livermore Avenue and Railroad Avenue, those are kind of looking like arterial streets there. So one treatment would be to spend, instead of spending money on a pedestrian bridge, you could invest in better tree canopy, trees on a center median, and other things that make it much more pedestrian friendly, and also send a message to the drivers that you're now in the downtown core. So in effect, you pull the downtown closer to where people are coming in from the north. So this is a view on top of the existing, looking south on Livermore Ave, coming just at Railroad Avenue. And below is actually a view of San Pablo Avenue in Berkeley, with a full height tree canopy. And you can see what a major difference it makes in terms of making a friendlier and green environment. Similarly, doing something on Railroad Avenue, which right now has very few trees, would make a huge difference in terms of making it feel much more pedestrian friendly and sending a message to the drivers that they've now arrived in a downtown, which is a different setting than coming in off an arterial. It also helps to add value to the property investments that would be potentially coming in. So doing these things might involve a combination of measures. Even just doing this for a half block coming in the front door would change that look and feel quite a bit. Travel lane widths might be looked at to see if they could be narrowed a bit. There could be maybe some small easements added to the frontage properties to allow for some room for the sidewalk, and some special planter details for the trees might be necessary to make them be able to grow very large canopy trees over time. And we should also note that this treatment already exists on Railroad Avenue from North L to North N Street, having median trees. So it's already has a precedent in downtown. Another aspect of pedestrian bridges and elevated walkways is the idea of, well, what if you landscape them? The model for that nowadays is the High Line in New York City, which is a former train trestle that's been converted into a linear park all through Lower Manhattan. It's very popular. It's really added some greenery into an area that desperately needed it. And it's possible to grow trees on an environment like that. You need at least about 4 feet of soil depth, and it takes quite a bit of maintenance because, again, it's not a natural environment. You're basically on life support up there. But one thing to consider is that when you have an elevated structure like that, the underside is another piece of your downtown. In New York City, of course, you can have things like brew pubs and so forth underneath because you have tremendous density of pedestrians and customers there. But in many cases, the uses are sort of more for parking and other things like that. Depending on how close the buildings are to either side, it can be pretty dark. And so in order to make sure that area feels good, you may have to look into making sure that you either have businesses opening onto that and enough amenity to make it right. And here also, it's a double height space. It really depends on whether you have, a low height or a high height to make it feel a little nicer. This concept is being played out all across the world, and that's an example here from Korea that's being looked at. And you can see here this cutaway shows how it's done with, again, about 4 feet of soil for the planting. Now, one other issue is the thing itself, meaning the pedestrian bridge structure or the elevated deck structure. It's almost like another piece of architecture in your town. So one issue is how compatible is it with the buildings around it? And so this pedestrian structure, which is the Iron Horse Trail pedestrian bridge at Costa Center in Walnut Creek, you can see it kind of contrasts with the kind of brick storefronts that transit-oriented cluster is trying to create there. So that's a question to ask in the context of Livermore downtown, is how well does that fit? So to sum up on pedestrian network, the idea of subdividing that big block with streets or paths is a given. When looking at the idea of parking structures, because of the 4 to 5 story height, those 3 above ground schemes have to factor in, can you wrap them with liner uses to reduce that impact? If pedestrian paths are blocked by a long garage, is some through path feasible? Is it possible to have ground floor activating uses? Like the commercial option, and also if you've got a tall building mass, it's going to cast a shadow, so that will affect how you'll place the open space. When you're looking at the possibility of pedestrian bridges over streets, most American pedestrians generally avoid making a special trip upstairs and downstairs unless there's no other choice. And then from a planning standpoint, removing street life generally isn't beneficial to downtown revitalization. That's why a lot of these skyways have been dismantled. An alternative would be to transform the street, actually, to make it more walkable and tamed with tree canopies and center medians and things like that, which might be another way to spend the same money. And then in terms of elevated walkways, it's possible to make a really nice environment up there, but it also can pull activity off the street unless there's tons of pedestrians already, like in Lower Manhattan. There is significant maintenance that's needed for that kind of environment, and the underside can be dark. So depending on how that space underneath is surrounded, either with storefronts or blank walls, it may need some more amenity to overcome that. And finally, does that elevated bridge structure itself match and complement the architecture and the place character? Finally, in terms of urban fabric issues, one note is that a key issue in that fabric is how many doors and windows you have facing streets, and how does that benefit the character of downtown. This is a map of ground level entrance frequency in downtown Redwood City connected with the precise plan that we did there. And you can see the main street has a really high density of doorways and storefronts, whereas moving off the main streets, you have less. So when it comes to thinking about how you create active passageways and open spaces in the center of the block, making sure that you have openings and doorways is a very important issue. One way to handle that with housing, for instance, is where this example is actually one in downtown Mountain View, and it was crucial to its early revitalization. It's called the Park Place Apartments. That was built at the same time its early revitalization was taking place in the early 90s. The first phase was 50 units an acre, and it was 3 stories above a semi-submerged parking podium. There were rental units from 750 to roughly 1,400 square feet of different sizes of units. Pretty substantial parking underground, which is actually a bit underutilized at present. The first phase was 7.5 acres, and a later phase 1.65, which you see here. The main street, Castro Street, is off to the right, and the first phase was the 7.5 acres, which was subdivided with paseos, green walkways that were 50 feet wide. So when you actually walk through this project, you can see that the scale is one where you have 3-story buildings that look like they're basically above a crawl space, kind of like a house. That's what the semi-sunken podium does. And we made sure that every ground floor unit facing a paseo had a stoop and a front door. And that was really key to making this feel like a really nice part of downtown. And in fact, even though the developer fought this, those ground floor units were waitlisted as soon as the project opened. So they were always in demand because people just loved being able to walk out their door and go to coffee shops and bookstores in the downtown. So this can be a really positive addition to the downtown in terms of adding people that go to the shops and patronize them and keep them alive and active at night. So in terms of looking at the big picture here, this core district, sub-district, is really the single place of greatest activity and density and height in the entire city. It's really a key to a vital downtown. So all the input and good urban design practice tells us that having that active and compact urban fabric served by passageways and urban open space and anchoring space with greenery is really important to make it feel good. A concentration of housing in the core is really important to creating what we call a captive population in downtown that is really beneficial to making sure that the restaurants, the coffee shops, and the stores are constantly peopled. And that also provides an important housing choice in the city. Not everybody's going to choose to live there, but a lot of folks, empty nesters, young singles, and other folks are really going to help, again, create that activity throughout the 18-hour cycle in downtown. 30 to 50 units an acre can be readily accommodated in 3 to 4 story development with varied massing. And again, that idea of a podium that's semi-submerged may be an alternative that's less of a problem than elevated parking structures. And finally, for downtown livability, ensuring that you have a high frequency of entrances along the public ways and passages that you want to make sure are successful is really important.